That day, when Trump fully exposed his own people for the first time, was not a day of a TV interview. It was not a rally stage. That day came inside a closed room where there were no cameras, no audience, no applause, only a grand jury and the compulsion to speak the truth under oath. And inside that room, a face of American politics came forward that had never been shown to the public. Because the very Republican leaders who publicly appeared to stand with Trump, who told the media that the election was stolen, who nodded their heads at every allegation made by Trump, those very people went before the court and admitted that the 2020 election was, in fact, not stolen at all. And this was not just an opinion, it was sworn testimony. And amid this entire storm, the most shocking name was Senator Lindsey Graham. The same Lindsey Graham who was considered Trump's most trusted ally, who defended Trump on every channel. But when he was forced to speak the truth before the law, he said that at that time, Trump was so confused that if someone had told him that aliens from Mars had come and stolen the votes, he would have believed that too. And this statement did not come from an opponent, but from Trump's own man, which meant that within the White House itself, there was an understanding that the president had become detached from reality. Yet publicly, no one dared to say this, because the politics of power had become heavier than the truth. And that was the moment when American democracy became the weakest. Because when the president of a country is lost in delusion and the leaders around him remain silent despite knowing it, the entire nation becomes a victim of that delusion. And that is exactly what happened after 2020. Courts were rejecting Trump's claims, one after another. Republican state officials were saying they had found no evidence of widespread fraud. Yet Trump's narrative was kept alive on television and social media. Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, on whom Trump had openly exerted pressure, clearly told the grand jury that he had told Trump, if you have evidence, go to court, because the Georgia administration had found nothing that could change the results. This statement was important because it showed that even leaders from Trump's own state knew the story had no substance. And Georgia Attorney General Chris Carr repeated the same thing, saying his office investigated every allegation but found no proof that the vote count was wrong. Despite this, Trump publicly pressured them, called them, demanded that they find votes. And all of this was happening at a time when Trump's own advisors and party leaders had internally accepted that the election was legitimate. Yet they did not tell the public this truth, because they feared that if they opposed Trump, their political careers would be over. And this fear became the greatest strength of the entire drama, because when leaders fall silent out of fear, lies spread without resistance. And in this environment, another dangerous plan was taking shape, later called the fake electors scheme. This was the idea of sending alternate electoral votes from states Trump had lost to create a paper reality that he had won. When journalist David Ralston testified about this, he called it one of the most insane maneuvers in American politics because it was an attempt to overturn democracy not through votes, but through manipulation. And all of this was happening while the most powerful people in the country knew the election was legitimate. Yet that truth was being hidden from the public. And that is the real heart of the story. This is not just Trump's story. It is the story of an entire political culture where truth is suppressed to protect power. And the most dangerous form of this culture appeared when Trump publicly claimed that America's election system had been taken over by some invisible force. While his own senators, his own governors, his own lawyers knew that courts have repeatedly rejected these claims. And this contradiction became the greatest tragedy of that era. On one side, the public was being told that democracy was under threat. On the other side, those sitting in the corridors of power accepted that the election was legitimate, yet they allowed the illusion to survive. That is why Lindsey Graham's testimony proved so explosive, because it exposed for the first time that Trump's closest people also knew he had drifted away from reality. Yet they kept that truth buried. Meanwhile, Trump's phone calls, his pressure-filled statements, and his tweets created an atmosphere in which millions of Americans began to believe that something massive had been stolen from the country, while inside Georgia, official records, recounts, and legal investigations all showed that votes were counted correctly. And that was the moment when politics overtook democracy. Because when truth and power stand face to face, power often wins. And during Trump's era, that is exactly what happened. That is why when Trump said in an interview with the New York Times that he regretted not ordering the National Guard to seize voting machines in 2020, it was not just a statement. It was proof of a mindset where losing an election is considered impossible and every loss is labeled a conspiracy. This was the same mindset his own allies privately considered dangerous but refused to acknowledge publicly. And this silence entered history because democracy does not collapse only because of those who lie. It collapses because of those who know the truth and still remain silent. That is why the Georgia case becomes so important, because here the strongest testimony against Trump did not come from his opponents, but from his own people. And this elevates the story far beyond an ordinary political dispute, because this is the story of a moment when America had to choose whether it would stand with truth or with power. And many chose power. And that is why when history looks back at that era, it will not only ask what Trump said, but what the people around him knew and still allowed to happen. And that was the moment when Trump's defeat stopped being a political reality and became a personal war inside his mind. Because when a leader refuses to accept defeat, he begins to see loss as an attack on his existence. And the same thing was happening with Trump. Every court loss, every disagreement by state officials became for him not evidence, but proof of an enemy's plot. That is why he exerted so much pressure on states like Georgia. He knew that if results were flipped in a few states, the entire electoral college could change. Under this strategy, he made repeated phone calls, sent messages, and used to supporters to apply psychological pressure on officials. And when Brad Raffensperger presented him with legal reality, Trump refused to accept it, because for him, truth meant defeat, and defeat was unacceptable. This mindset placed the people around him in a dangerous position as well. They knew the president was drifting away from reality, but they also knew that openly challenging him could destroy their political careers. And this fear became the most valuable political currency of that period. Lindsey Graham and others were trapped between fear and knowledge, knowing the election was legitimate, but publicly standing with Trump. This double life became the most toxic element of American politics. On one side, the country was told democracy had been stolen. On the other side, those in power knew democracy was intact. And this contradiction filled millions of minds with doubt, anger, and mistrust. That is why the Georgia case is no longer just a legal matter. It has become a historical document, because it shows how power politics can suppress truth and how a lie stays alive until someone has the courage to challenge it. And during Trump's era, very few showed that courage. That is why, when these testimonies finally became public, America understood for the first time what was really happening. How many people behind the scenes knew the president was wrong, yet allowed him to move forward anyway? And that is the greatest lesson of this story. Democracy is not protected by law alone, it is protected by moral courage. And when that courage bows before politics, history extracts a heavy price. January 6th is no longer just a date in American history. It has become a mirror in which the country can see itself. Because what happened on Capitol Hill that day was not the result of a sudden mob. It was the harvest of a lie planted over months, repeated in every speech, every TV show, every social media post. When Trump stood before his supporters and said the country had been stolen from them, he was not just expressing grief over his loss. He was convincing an entire population that democracy itself had turned against them. And that belief made the crowd feel they were standing against a crime, when in reality they were attacking the very system that had protected America for centuries. The bitterest truth is that leaders who privately accepted the election was legitimate made no serious public effort to stop the lie. And that empty space allowed anger, confusion, and extremism to grow. Lindsey Graham's testimony gives the clearest picture of that space. Because when he says Trump could believe any fantasy, he is describing not just one man, but an entire movement. One driven not by facts, but by emotion. That is why, even when courts repeatedly said there was no evidence of fraud, millions were unwilling to accept it, because Trump's word had become greater than any proof. And that was the moment when politics turned into a belief system. And when politics becomes belief, questioning it feels like sin. That is why much of Republican leadership stayed silent, because they feared becoming targets of their own voters. And that fear is the most dangerous thing for a democratic society, because when leaders fear public anger more than truth, democracy's backbone begins to break. And that was the moment American politics faced its most dangerous test, because when the Capitol was attacked, the world saw how words can become weapons. That attack was not just by a crowd, it was by a lie that had been allowed to spread unchecked for months. And today, when grand jury testimonies have come out, they are not just legal records. They are moral indictments. They show how people at the highest levels of power knew the election was legitimate, yet allowed the country to believe democracy had been stolen, and that belief pushed people onto streets, onto the steps of parliament, and into the Capitol itself. This was the point where politics gave birth to violence, and it was all possible because the courage to speak the truth in time was missing. That is why Lindsey Graham's testimony matters so deeply, because it proves everyone behind the scenes knew Trump was wrong, yet no one tried with full force to stop him, and that is the most terrifying lesson of the story. Democracy does not collapse when one person lies. It collapses when many people know the truth and remain silent. And today, when America looks back at that period, the question is not only what Trump did, but what those around him allowed to happen. After January 6th, American politics was never the same, because that day, not only were the walls of the Capitol broken, the illusion that those at the top would always protect democracy was broken as well. And in that shattered trust, the Georgia case emerged with new meaning, because now the question was no longer just what Trump did, but why. When everyone knew the election was legitimate, the lie was allowed to go so far. That is where grand jury testimonies enter history, because they show the battle between truth and politics inside America's power structure. Lindsey Graham's testimony offers the clearest image of this battle. A man who was one of Trump's closest allies admitting in court that the president had detached from reality. This double life became the greatest political tragedy of that era. One store for the public, another behind closed doors. And if that truth had emerged earlier, history might have taken a different direction. The Georgia investigation was no longer based only on Trump's statements, but are all the conversations, phone calls, and plans aimed at overturning the election by any means. That is why the case was taken so seriously, because it went straight to the roots of democracy. When a leader believes his will matters more than the voters, he begins to place himself above the Constitution. Georgia prosecutors argue Trump's actions reflected exactly this thinking. This was not a political attack, but a legal question. Did a person in power cross the boundaries of law? And the answer lay not in Trump's words alone, but in the testimony of his own allies. Testimonies by Brian Kemp and Chris Carr prove Trump was repeatedly told his claims would not survive in court, and that was the moment when a president had to decide whether to accept truth or cling to his narrative. Trump chose the narrative, and that choice pushed America toward a constitutional crisis. Meanwhile, the American public was also changing. After January 6th, many people began to realize they may not have been told the full truth. And when parts of the testimonies came out, it shocked many voters to learn that leaders they trusted privately knew one thing and publicly said another. This breaking trust became a new challenge for American democracy, because democracy runs not only on elections, but on trust. And when that trust breaks, rebuilding it is extremely difficult. And this breaking trust became the biggest outcome of the entire episode. Because when people feel those in power are not telling the full truth, democracy itself becomes a question. And the Georgia case placed that question before America. Is the law equal for everyone, or are there different rules for the powerful? That is why prosecutors treated the case with such seriousness. Because if presidents or their allies learn they can challenge election results to any extent and escape consequences, no future election will be safe. That is why grand jury testimonies are not just records of the past. They are warnings for the future. They show how a lie, if not stopped in time, can change the direction of an entire nation. And Lindsey Graham's admission is the sharpest form of that warning, showing that even Trump's closest people knew he was drifting away from reality, yet refused to admit it publicly. That is where morality and politics collided, and politics won. And America is still paying the price for that victory in division, mistrust, and extremism. The Georgia case will continue to remind future generations that democracy's greatest threat does not come from outside, but from within, when its own guardians choose convenience over truth. No constitution is stronger than the people who uphold it. And when those people compromise with truth, history writes a new and often painful chapter. American democracy was not built in a single day, nor does it collapse in one day. It is built on generations of faith, law, and institutions. And the Georgia election interference case became the hardest test of that faith. For the first time, it became so clear that those at the top privately knew the truth, but publicly allowed a different story to run. And this is where history places not only the leader, but those around him in the dock. Trump believing the election was a conspiracy against him was one thing, His allies knowing the truth and still not challenging that delusion was far more serious. That is why names like Lindsey Graham, Brian Kemp, and Chris Carr become so important. Their testimonies show no one behind the scenes was confused about the election's legitimacy. Confusion was manufactured only for the public. That was the greatest political failure of that era, because in a democracy, telling the truth to the public is the highest duty. And when that duty loses to political convenience, the country pays the price. January 6th became its bitterest example. The attack on a Capitol was not just on a building, but on the trust between citizens and their leaders. And that attack was possible because a lie spread for months without serious challenge. Now, with grand jury testimonies public, we see how easily it could have been stopped if those in power had shown courage. And that is the question that will haunt America for years. Are laws alone enough to protect democracy, or must leaders also possess moral courage? And that question is what makes this story far bigger than a political controversy. Because when history looks at the Georgia election interference case, it will not only ask what Donald Trump said or did, it will ask what the people around him knew and still allowed to happen. Lindsey Graham's line that Trump could believe any fantasy will stand for decades as a symbol of that era's mindset. It shows how far the person at the top had drifted from reality and how those around him knew that distance yet chose to hide it. And that was the moment when American democracy faced its greatest danger, not from outside, but from within. Because no constitution remains safe unless the people who uphold it place truth first. And the Georgia case teaches us that laws, courts, and institutions work only when political leadership is honest with them. When that honesty breaks, a nation pays the price in chaos, mistrust, and division. That is why this story ends not with one person, but with the entire system. Trump refusing to accept defeat was a personal failure. His allies failing to stop the lie was an institutional failure. Understanding that difference is essential for the future, so that the next time a leader runs from truth, those around him stop him, instead of silently letting him move forward. Because democracy is not protected by votes alone. It is protected by courage. The courage to speak truth to power. And that courage finally appeared in Georgia's courts, where the truth was placed on record after being hidden for so long. And that is the final and most important lesson of this story. Late or not, the truth eventually comes out.